You're not cheating on your wife if you eat my lemon square. Your lemon squares taste like ass.
All right, well, welcome back to another Horror Queers Hangout. We are joined this month by Lindsay Traves, as well as Genius McGee. And folks, I thought in light of X coming out last month and getting I saw some weird responses where people are like, oh, this doesn't feel like an A24 film. I was like, let's have a conversation about A24 horror films. It wasn't just you, Trace.
So it's actually really funny, not to call anyone out, but a friend of mine, no, I'm not, but I'm just on the off chance that he's going to watch this and be like, wow, what the fuck, Lindsay? A friend of mine was like smack talking X because he was like, man, A24, he's making dumb horror movies that trick you into thinking they're smart. And I was like, I feel like that's not what X did, literally at all. So I wonder, anyway, all that to say, I agree that it didn't necessarily feel like an A24 horror movie, because I think we associate that with Hereditary and those types of things. And X is just what's up?
We associate it with slow burns. And it was interesting though, and I'm not going to call anyone out either, but someone I talked to was like, oh, I went to go see X. It was really slow in the first half. I was a bit surprised. And I was like, it was so much faster paced than what I was expecting walking into, again, what I would consider an A24 horror film.
And see, that's what I don't understand. I mean, I get it. And I'm notorious as an non-A24 fan, right? On a lot of things.
Yeah.
But it seems like, and looking back doing research, it's very different. I don't even know if I can say, A24 horror now, because looking back on seeing some of this stuff that's been released, I don't know. It just seems like they're way more varied than people give them credit for. Me included. Me included. And especially because, it's new elevated A24 horror. And I'm like, first of all, I don't like that term.
No,
I think all horror can be elevated. I mean, without it being necessarily a slow burn or necessarily thought-provoking. I mean, not all horror has to have super, super, super deep messages in them. So I don't, and on the flip side of that, not all horror has to be just schlock. So I don't agree with the elevated term, but I don't know, when there's a stigma that A24 movies have nowadays, whether good, bad, or indifferent, you're going to either champion everything that A24 puts out, like their shit don't stink, or you're going to be like, you know what, A24 is not for me. But that's almost too broad of a term when you look at things, because there's a lot of shit on A24 that I'm like, oh yeah, that is an A24. I really liked that movie.
Well, here's the thing. Do you folks think that it's now just become a marketing issue as opposed to the range of the films that they're releasing? Because it seems like as soon as people see the logo now, they've already decided whether or not this is going to be a movie for them. Okay,
so here's the thing though too. How much of that is us being in a film Twitter bubble where we are around people who just know? Because a regular audience is not going to see A24 logo on a trailer and be like, oh, I know what I'm getting. That's going to be that slow burn horror shit. That really is us. And so it could be that, Joe, because I mean, we'll go back to Hereditary. Something like Hereditary was marketed, it's always like the scariest film you'll ever see, blah, 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 blah. And that sets up expectations for something that is not the type of scary that mainstream audiences are wanting, which is why you see those low cinema scores, because they're like, this is boring, or this is not, that wasn't even scary, or it had a bad ending,
I would almost take your point half a step farther and be like, we're also in a pretty horror crowd, right? So we associate A24 with A24 horror, which is really not. I don't think that you would necessarily describe A24 as a horror imprint.
Yes.
It's
not Blumhouse.
Do you know what I mean? I think that, and even Blumhouse has kind of, spread their wings
diversifying now.
But I don't know. I think that, what isn't Zola A24 and
yep.
I mean,
Euphoria.
not even horror. Yeah. Not even horror adjacent, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I think that's also part of it, is that we might associate with slow burn horror, but even that is
well, but even something I mean, and this could be horror, but maybe not, but Green Room is A24.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. I mean, Moonlight is A24, and that's not horror at all.
Right.
I think when it comes down to A24 horror, you can break it down into two camps, especially with the studio itself, the way that they market it. You either have pre-Ari Aster or post-Ari Aster. because it seemed like pre-Ari Aster, it was just a mixed bag of whatever. I mean, you'd have stuff like Tusk, you'd have stuff like
Genius.
Green Room.
Here, I'll do a rapid fire really quick of pre-Hereditary, because that's really what it is, right? So, Under the Skin, Life After Beth, Tusk, Ex Machina, The Witch, Green Room, The Monster, The Black Coat's Daughter. It Comes a Night actually is a big one, I think, though. I think that's
often
really
gets
one
lumped
that
in there.
These are all pre-Hereditary?
Pre-Hereditary, and then it's Killing of a Sacred Deer, which you could say is horror or not, and then it's Hereditary.
But then after Hereditary, every single A24 movie you have, whether it be horror or anything, from the studio that brought you Hereditary, from the studio that brought you Midsommar, even if the tone or the material is nothing like that. Because you know what? If you told me Green Room, the studio that brought you Hereditary, that would have instantly turned me off, because you know my feelings on Hereditary and Midsommar. Yeah. But like
not
going
a fan,
back, and
he is not.
not a fan.
That makes me so sad.
That's sad. Yeah.
No, and you know what? That's another thing. Okay,
each their own.
Let's do an air of grievances. No, going back on A24, I think it also made a lot of fans dismissive, because now you have things along the lines of like, I don't like A24 horror. And I used to say in that camp, but recently looking back on it, I really like a lot of A24 horror. But then you have this weird divisive thing, and especially you see it on the Facebooks when you're not a fan of like slower burns or 820. I mean, I love slow burn movies. I'm just not a fan of Hereditary or Midsommar. I don't like Ari Aster. Right. But I do have to defend myself a lot of times when you say like,
because people
the new
will come
A24, they will come with vengeance. Oh, then you just must not get smart horror. Then yeah.
Okay,
like,
I have a grenade
go
for
back
this.
To slashers and things like that. And I'm like, why? I'm like that little Mexican girl in the commercials. Why not both?
Indeed, why not both?
Here's a passing thought. Hereditary is to horror what Batman Begins is to superhero movies. Would you agree?
Like it kind of reset the expectations and kind of the stage, you mean?
Yeah, and we reset a tone in a lot of works, and then it was always something that was being compared. Everything was being compared to them, and if you didn't like it, maybe you didn't get it because it was smarter and different from before. But really, like, it wasn't smarter or different from before. It was just like something that had something. I don't know, just a passing thought.
And the thing with Hereditary, I mean, again, I feel like a lot of these movies actually do reward multiple rewatches, and I'm not just Hereditary, but all of them do, because again, you're distracted, you'll miss things, and you'll catch them more in a rewatch. But even post Hereditary, though, the mix. I mean, so the first horror film they have after Hereditary is Slice, the pizza horror comedy movie,
which always gets forgotten about in these conversations, right? If you're like, oh, let's talk about A24 horror, Slice, the movie that no one will ever bring up.
Yeah,
right.
Sorry, what are some of the other ones, Trace?
So it's Slice, Hole in the Ground, Climax, then Midsommar, The Lighthouse, and Fabric. And they haven't, at least on the Wikipedia page, is the last thing that like popped up for horror for them. But like, I mean, since Hereditary for non-horror, you've got Disaster Artist, 8th Grade, The Farewell, Uncut Gems, and of course, Everything Everywhere All at Once that just came out.
Right. So I'm intrigued I'm intrigued by this thing with Hereditary, because I do feel like that is kind of like the tipping point for some of this. But I'm fascinated because I want to come back to what you said, Trace, which is like, well, maybe we're in the horror bubble and we don't know what general audiences are thinking. But it's weird to me that the conversation would come back to Hereditary then, because Hereditary is really the most popular within horror fans, like horror fan circles.
But also made the most money mainstream. I think Hereditary, maybe Lady Bird is their highest grossing film.
But like, how high is that gross? Because like, I feel like if you just
40.
ask general audiences, like, how many people saw Hereditary? Like, the gross is not high. We're not talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars.
Right. But $44 million for a movie like Hereditary, that's domestic gross, by the way, is pretty substantial. But again, you have a lot of audiences that are tricked into it going like, oh, I'm going to be scared of my wits. And they go and they are bored.
And like, I don't know, man, I think Hereditary is so scary, but that's probably the most scared I've ever been in a theater is Hereditary. I was like sore the next day because I was so tense the whole time, and my theater was really hot. Like it was so hot. So we were like sweating, but scared. And like, anyway, so like my muscles were a disaster for like 3 days after. But I also think that Hereditary broke into like a more, I don't even want to say like mainstream horror audience. Like, how many of your horror fan, like if you met a horror fan like at work, well, I don't know, I guess all of us kind of, but like not in your like horror circles, like if you were just like out and someone was like, oh, John's into horror too, would you expect that like John had seen In Fabric and had seen, like, do you know what I mean? I think there's like a little bit of like of a spread there, and I think that maybe Hereditary wasn't mainstream per se, but it was like mainstream horror, like Hereditary.
But it was marketed like it was mainstream though, because they knew they had like a critical, like a super critical hit. And again, when you have reviews that are pulling up like, you know, scariest film since The Exorcist, which I'm sure was a quote that was used in some review that they pulled.
Probably. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's good. I wish I came up with it.
Boo, pull quotes. Well, I wonder too. I
can't write a pull quote to save my life. Yeah.
I mean, I'm remembering that at the time when, just to stay on the Hereditary train, when it came out, there was actual talk that Toni Collette could get an Oscar nomination, to the point that Trace and I literally named our horror award show after that film. You know, to toot our own horns, like anyway. But I wonder if that was another piece of that puzzle, right? It's like, okay, well, this is a studio that now could be synonymous with winning or even just being nominated for Oscars, which is something that even though we as horror fans say we don't care as much about, we are still craving that kind of legitimacy.
But it's not just, oh, this is a studio that produces like Oscar-worthy films, or at least like films that could get recognized by the Academy, but it's specifically those horror films, right? Like horror is a historically ignored genre in critics' award circles. And so when you have a movie that was like, oh, like this is 90% certain going to get a nomination, spoiler alert, it didn't, but that's also good for them as business. Even if they don't get it, like that's going to bring people to your theater. Even though people say they don't care about the Oscars, if people say, oh, if you slap that Oscar thing on your trailer, they're going to go for it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are an Academy Award winning studio. I mean, with
multiple
Moonlight,
times over.
Yeah, multiple times on it. So I don't know. It just seems like when it comes to horror, they're always like from the studio that brought you Hereditary, or even when it's something. It would make more sense if something's like more offbeat from the studio that brought you Tusk. You know, so
no, the Tusk thing is bizarre to me. I love Tusk, but I know a lot of people don't like Tusk.
I thought Tusk was great.
It's so funny and also at the same time very upsetting. Like it balances those tones very well. But okay, so let's leave the Midsummer train though, and then go to something modern like X. You know, I did say leading up to when I saw the trailer, I was like, this doesn't look like a Ty West film, and this doesn't look like an A24 film, and that excited me because I was like, I'm excited to see like what these two things, Ty West and 24, do with this, which is kind of a marriage of schlock with that elevated horror, again using that term loosely, but like what they're known for, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah,
but it hasn't taken off box office wise.
No. I feel like who was I don't know, I mean, you two, two of you have different marketing than we do here very often. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I haven't heard anything about this film, and then people be like, what? Like they play the trailer at the Super Bowl, and I'm like, oh, not in our feed. So like, I don't know.
Yeah,
so
Canadians are a little different, Lindsay, and I should acknowledge.
Yeah, sorry, hi from Canada. So every so often I'm like, I don't know, like I think that it's a marketing thing that I'm just like completely wrong about. But I feel like X was not marketed to me at all. If I hadn't been like in horror circles following like the Fango Twitter feed, I wouldn't know that it existed.
You know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the only trailer released for that film was a Red Band trailer because it has the line where the guy's like one fucked up. I'm sorry, the last line of the film is in the trailer. But I saw it in front of every movie I went to go see at the Alamo Drafthouse. So I got that trailer every movie. But I also don't know if AMC is going to be showing a Red Band trailer for X in their theaters. And I, at least to my knowledge, have not seen a Green Band trailer for that film online.
But that's also smart, depending on what movie you put it on there. Because I mean, if you're going for genre fans, it makes sense to put it on a genre trailer. Even though like it is an Academy Award winning movie, you still wouldn't want to put it on like Paddington 2.
But what I'm saying, Jenius, is though, like I don't know if something like AMC or Regal is going to put a Red Band trailer in front of any movie because even an R-rated movie, because it's I can't tell you if I've ever seen a Red Band trailer in a non like special like the Drafthouse theater.
Yeah, it's tricky. I'm watching a lot of trailers basically from Twitter links or like if I'm going onto YouTube, and of course those are algorithm driven, so if I'm not clicking on the right things, I'm not going to see them. And we should clarify, X is technically doing reasonably well. At the time of this recording, it will have just crossed $10 million at the box office, which is like, okay, it's small potatoes when you look at something like Hereditary's 44 or something, like Halloween Kills. But I guess this is still reasonably well considering the smaller market that it has debuted in.
I wonder if it also... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Plus, it's niche because you're dealing with a throwback movie, dealing with pornography, and we are in a very puritanical society here in America. So, like, a lot of people aren't gonna. One, that's already the horror aspect's gonna turn them off. Two, the pornography aspect's gonna turn them off. Three, the throwback aspect's gonna turn them off. So, I think when you have a real niche, the fact that you can make so much money and be both critically acclaimed and like hated because it's 2022. Every new horror movie is either the best thing ever or absolute trash on the internet. So, it's cool to see them actually make a lot of money for such a niche little genre film. It's basically the Boogie Nights Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Well, and I guess too, it's like, well, I don't know. You're right, Joe. 10 million might be very well for X. I don't really know what A24, like, were they expecting something higher? Were they expecting something lower? Or is this doing about what they expected? To me, it did seem like they were marketing this movie more than some of the other films they released. But again, like what you just said, Lindsay, you weren't seeing a lot of marketing for it. So I feel like it's so much harder for me to feel like I have the finger on the pulse of buzz. Like, I mean, this is not horror related, but like I remember when Uncharted came out back in February, I was like, that movie's gonna bomb. Like, no one gives a shit about it. I haven't heard any buzz about it. The marketing isn't that great. And then it, overperforms at $50 million opening weekend. So I'm like, I have no idea what is going on anymore.
We're all just completely out of touch.
Yeah, I feel like I have no idea anymore.
How do you think they're going to market Pearl?
Well, that was the other thing. Like, they must have expected some success because they like already made the sequel. So they must have had some sort of expectation.
Right.
But then I guess, like, I don't know what the budget was, but I guess if your business model isn't to make Halloween money, your business model is to make 5 million or whatever, then great. Keep them coming.
Well, I think that's where we start to come back to things like, okay, is it that A24 is starting to sell things based on its prestige and they're trying to grow the kind of, I don't want to say like the audience expectations, but they are looking to be in the business of making certain types of movies. So as long as those movies do reasonably well, but continue to gain the acclaim that A24 is seemingly looking for.
It's almost like, okay, so like, I like what you said about, like using their prestige, because I guess if I was going to compare A24 to like something like similar, it's like Criterion, a lot of regular film goers are not going to be seeking out these Criterion Blues and 4Ks because they're not films they would normally want to seek out. There's like the historically like significant films for the most part. But then again, you throw in something from A24 and you're like, oh yeah, they did Tusk. They did Obvious Child. They did Spring Breakers, I guess is kind of artsy. But it's like
Spring Breakers.
I don't like Spring Breakers at all, but
okay, we'll fight about that later.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm liking the A24 now is, I don't want to say it's shedding its old image, but like it just seemed like when it came to horror movies, for lack of a better term, it was just grief porn, right?
Okay.
And so now it feels like they're embracing their weirdness with going back to the roots of Tusk and other than they're embracing their weirdness with like everything all at once. I like the fact that they're just like, oh, go on.
No. Again, like we go with the Daniels, like Swiss Army Man is probably it is weird and maybe less audience friendly, but then you have their second film, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is out, and that is, the premise is kind of like, oh wait, like you might have to like sit this down and like talk through this, but it's a very audience friendly film. But if you were telling a friend to go see an A24 movie, would you give them, and let's say it's a non-horror, non-film friend, would you give them a primer or be like, hey, or give them some kind of be like, hey, like just so you know, this is A24 and this is kind of what they do, so this is the type of film you're going to see? Or would you just let them go?
Yeah, I don't think I would. I don't think that general audiences are like as concerned with like studio reputation as maybe we are. Like, I don't think.
Well, but if you were telling someone to go see Hereditary, would you be like, hey, but just a heads up, this is a slow burn, like drama film with a lot of horror elements in it?
But here's the thing.
Yeah,
I feel like
it's like a slow burn scary movie.
I feel like this is the distinction between A24 as an entire business and A24 horror specifically. Is like I don't know that we talk about A24 as like a business entity where they do have these really like, I think people forget that Moonlight or Spring Breakers or those kinds of films came out from A24 because that's not what we associate that brand with. But specifically, if we look at horror, then it's like, oh, if I say A24 horror, people now know what that means. And they do have certain expectations. And it is tied, you're right, Genius, to Hereditary, Midsommar. I think it's also because they're curating certain types of talent, right? Like they've formed a relationship with Robert Eggers. They're releasing all of his movies. They formed a relationship with Ari Aster. They're releasing all of his movies. So like that kind of keeps them within a certain wheelhouse, even as they try to break out of the grief horror porn.
Here's the thing. I actually think a lot of those types of horror films, like these A24 films, are very reminiscent of horror films from the 70s. Because if I went back and my husband and I rewatched The Exorcist last year, and both of us were like, hey, it's amazing. Yeah. But, it's a movie called The Exorcist, and the exorcism takes place in the last 20 minutes of the film. And it's like, this feels like, again, to be kind of silly, but like an A24 film of that era. Like if A24 existed, The Exorcist would be their film. Or Joe, Don't Look Now is very much like, it's a horror film, but it's like not more than that. That sounds like reducing horror. But like, again, any of those films, like people walk into The Exorcist and like, they're like, oh, I'm expecting something. And they walk in and they get, this 20-minute prologue in Iraq.
Right.
Like I was watching Let's Scare Jessica to Death, and I was thinking, this is 70s A24.
Yeah,
this is 100% A. And I think there's that synonymous. It's very A24-esque. You think of it's like very slow and very methodical and a lot more psychological than Monsters. And I hate to say they're like, oh well, then it's way more better than jump scares. But there's a lot of jump scares in a lot of A24 films.
This is true. There's also a movie called The Monster from the director of The Strangers that is really, really good, but is ultimately about a monster on a highway.
But see, that's what the one thing I'm liking, that A24 is kind of diversifying, not going even in the horror, not putting all their eggs now in like the grief porn basket. Because me and a lot of other people that I know, like if you say like, hell, it's very A24, it's like, okay, I'll give it a shot, Yeah. But like movies with like this, like X, I like, this is great. This is not what I was expecting when I think of an A24 film. But then again, I think because we're so used to that cultivation of the Robert Eggers and the Ari Aster, that's what we're expecting with it. I think it might be wise for them to expand their horizons. I'm not just, again, not putting their eggs in those two directors' horror baskets.
I don't feel like they have. Like, I think it feels like they have because those movies were so popular, but like I don't go into a movie like X and expect that it's gonna be Hereditary. Like, yeah, like I don't know. I also think like what's really, like, not to like totally change the subject, so please feel free to stop me in my tracks, but we talked about the business of A24 briefly, and I think about like what I think about when I think of A24, and I know that Magnolia is not exactly like an indie whatever, but same with Magnolia, is that we, and I don't say we to mean us, I mean like audiences complain that like the only things that go to theaters are big epic cinema because it's the only thing people buy tickets for, and blah blah. And we started to really like rate movies of like, if they're not getting hundreds of millions of dollars, they're bombs. And so Morbius is being compared to Spider-Man or whatever, like that's the conversation we have, and it's like, oh man, it's all big epics, it's all IP, and like complain about it, as where you've got these studios like A24 and whatever that are making these smaller movies looking for a smaller gain, and like that's potentially their business model. I don't know what's going on inside A24 HQ, but that's guessing. I think that's really special. I don't know. I think that's more to me what they do. That's more what I associate with them versus like their slow burn or their tone or whatever.
But actually, no, but that brings up a good point though, because a lot of people were complaining about the staggered release for Everything Everywhere All at Once, because it was supposed to open on March 25th and it was only in New York, LA, and San Francisco, but they didn't market it that way. It was opening March 25th. And so a lot of people were like, why isn't it playing anywhere near me? But that's the thing. But I think for them, I mean, that is a marketing tactic, and that is a way to build buzz. You start in the bigger cities, it opens wider on the first, and it opens everywhere on the 8th. So the hope is that by the 8th, everyone's going to want to go see it because they've heard all this buzz. But also at the same time, the reviews came out 3 weeks before. So I find it interesting that for this particular movie, they are banking on audience buzz rather than critical buzz when they already know it's like a huge hit with critics.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I think because if you want to hit the mass appeal for people, you got to ignore the critic score. Because like a lot of people nowadays are like, man, you know what? I don't give a fuck about what critics say. I'm going to go in and like the movie I like. That's why you have to almost have the critical and then the audience score on the Rotten Tomatoes.
You are right about that, Genius. And a lot of people just say they don't care about critics, but you know what they do care about? A number. And they care about that Rotten Tomatoes number.
They care about the Rotten Tomatoes score. It's so true.
And that's a whole nother topic, but like the number of people who were like Rotten Tomatoes gave it this. I'm like, no.
Yeah,
Rotten Tomatoes didn't get it is an aggregate site and people don't get it. So they're like, oh, I don't care what critics say, but they'll go to fucking Rotten Tomatoes, and as long as it has that fucking fresh thing, they're fine, which I get it. I just wish people were smarter.
It's funny. So like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to kind of build on that because I feel like one of the other things that we started to see, it's not an exclusively A24 thing, but I think it benefits A24 because their films are often well reviewed because they are more psychological, less reliant on jump scares, which are things that critics tend to dismiss horror for. But we start to see more of like the Rotten Tomatoes approved or like, 90% fresh on like literal movie posters and like physical media releases and that kind of stuff too.
I'm like, I get it because I know audiences. So I know people hate it, but it's like, but it gets people to watch the movie.
It works. Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, just speaking of In Fabric, when I was like, oh, your average horror fan, I sat at work for a bit. I sat beside this guy who was a horror fan, and I was super cryptic about my nightlife, so to speak, because my job was very much like, you will have no free time ever or else. So
I like how you make it sound salacious, Lindsay, like, ooh,
yeah,
my nightlife, like it's not like you're moonlighting like a sex worker
or a vampire.
I was like, I'm just going to a movie for fun. You'd be like, you better not be there worried about it. So I was super, anyway, very quiet about it, and he was very cool dude, and he was like, hey, have you seen In Fabric? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, did you like it? And I was like, not really, like, wasn't really for me, whatever. He was like, me neither. He's like, that's one of those like critic bait movies that like horror critics love but real people don't. And I was like, yeah, fuck those guys. Like,
fuck those critics. Meanwhile, writing for Pajiba on the side.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah,
let me send you some of my reviews.
Yeah, I was like, oh yeah, I totally agree with you. They suck. And they would love that movie, and I hate it, therefore.
When it comes to that, though, I'm always like, look, I get when people think, oh, critics, like, they hate everything, and they only like really like whatever movies. And I'm like, yeah, but the thing is, if you had to write 800 words about a movie, about your opinions on a movie 3 times a week, let's say, you would also have a very similar opinion because you are seeing a lot of things, and you're also, like, literally having to rack your brain, like, well, what was good, what was bad, outside of, was I entertained? Because that seems to be a lot of what and I'm not trying to like come down on general audiences, but a lot of it seems to come down to, was I entertained? And that's the bare minimum. And if it succeeds at that, it's good.
Well, I mean, we're asking people to spend their money, right? So at the end of the day, it's like, is this a kind of movie that you're going to enjoy? And I mean, I think to circle back to what Jenius was mentioning earlier about the kind of like grief porn that some people associate A24 with, for lack of a better term, it's like, it's tricky, right? Because some of these movies don't have happy endings. Like if we're looking down the list, it's like a lot of these movies have either ambiguous endings or very unhappy endings. And those aren't typically crowd-pleasing films. So it's curious to me that A24 can almost now start to market themselves along those lines. Like if you're looking for something that will actively make you feel bad, we have a deep bench of movies that will do that to you. They will fuck you up.
You feel
the
bad.
feel bad movie of the year.
Basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to think. I'm like, do A24? Yeah. I mean, I think.
Well, the horror does.
Hereditary makes me feel bad. That's true. But
by design.
Right.
Oh,
I don't think Midsummer makes me feel bad necessarily.
Well, wait. Let's go down the list. You know,
let's do a litmus test.
Yeah.
Under the Skin.
Oh my god, I fucking love it. But it's like I think that movie leaves people cold.
Yeah,
It does.
But
It
I did
is.
dig that
It's
movie.
ambiguous, and I
Mhm.
think I've only seen it once, and it was like when it came out, like within a couple of years, whenever it
Yeah.
like, came to.
I really liked it, but it's one of those, and I know we'll have to watch for the podcast, Joe. But like, it's one of those moments I never want to see this again. Like,
Yeah, I
I'm
was like-
good.
God, I love it. I would watch it every week.
Okay,
Okay,
Life After Beth.
I haven't seen that
Not
one.
good.
Oh, Aubrey Plaza as a zombie.
I do
Yes,
love her,
not good,
so-
not funny.
It's not as good as Funny as, and I love me some Aubrey Plaza.
Oh, she's
and I was
fantastic.
just
But
like,
the cast, like Dane
It's a
DeHaan,
good
Molly
cast.
Shannon, John C. Reilly, and you're like, where are the jokes? It's that
Yeah.
RuPaul gif. Where are
Right.
the jokes?
I got like
Um,
told I looked like her once, and I've been like telling myself, like one person in the UK
Mm.
said that I look like Aubrey Plaza. Like I don't, but I've been like telling myself that for
Yeah.
like
Handle that
8 years
energy.
since. Yeah, I'm like, yeah. Anyway, keep going.
Tusk.
I love
like
Tusk.
Seen it.
Tusk
I
is
love
great.
it, but
love
but
it.
it does
It's
leave you
weird.
feeling like, oh,
It's icky, right?
at the end.
Yeah, it's not a
It's
happy
not a happy
ending. It's
ending.
very
Mm-mm.
upsetting, but it's funny enough though that even though it's a sad ending, it doesn't make you feel bad. You're just like, oh shit.
With-
well, because it's Kevin Smith. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
funny, even if you're being serious, there's always going to be a little bit of humor in there. Because
I
Yeah,
think
but
it's like
Red State guy.
I saw that in a theater. It was a very small theater with like 20 seats, and it was full. And the audience reactions to that movie.
But I feel like between even those first three, right? Like we're getting such a taster of what's
Right.
to come, right? Like we've got a very sort of surreal, kind of like
Mhm.
intellectual with Under the Skin.
avant-garde.
Yes.
And then we've got kind of schlocky, not always well executed comedy with Life After Beth. And then we've got Tusk, which is like a full-blown what the fuckery.
I'm so excited for you to finally see Tusk, Joe. It's going to be very.
oh my
well,
god.
I
know.
don't
I
know
hate
if
that
you'll
you
like
kind of
it,
know
but-
where it's gonna go, but it doesn't really.
Right.
It
But-
kind of sucks. But I think what's cool about Tusk, I don't know. I love Tusk. I saw it. Like I've already told you all this. Like I saw it at the Midnight Madness TIFF screening where like they gave us all Tusk masks to wear the whole like. It was the best. It was so great. And I had the best time, and it was rowdy because those screenings always are.
Yeah.
But I think what's so cool about Tusk is like it's gutsy, as we're like,
Yes.
you know what? This is a thought that I have not fully formed because I'm just thinking it now. But like, you know, we talk about things like, oh, the studio probably made them do that. Do you know what I mean? Like the studio
Yeah.
probably made them have a Joker moment in the Batman, or the studio, and like you could fathom someone being like, there's a studio that was like, oh, you can't end your movie that way. As we're
Mhm.
like A24 maybe was like, sure, Kevin.
Sure.
Well,
we gave you
no,
$4 million.
no,
Go forth.
But the thing with Tusk is though, because they play over the credits, the podcast episode where they
Right.
came up with the plot, and they have the ending of the movie
there.
in that audio, so they can't change it anyway.
No.
Right.
Okay,
true,
wait.
true. But
Moving
yeah,
on.
Sorry. Go on.
Ex Machina.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's a
Great
good for
movie.
her ending, but you also
Yeah.
feel bad for your
Yes.
protagonist.
And like humanity in a
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
The Witch.
I mean, I think that's a
adore
happy
The
ending.
Witch.
Yeah.
You see, I
exactly.
think to me that is like the defining prototype for A24.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think so too.
I think between that and Blackcoat's Daughter, those are the two
Yes.
defining ones.
But honestly, more so than Hereditary, I think The Witch is the one that I think of because people were like, I couldn't understand what they were saying, and I was like, I don't know what to tell you. They were accents.
I don't
It's
know.
not that hard.
Whenever someone's like, I can't understand what they're saying with like accents, I'm like, what is going on? Like, do I have a really good ear? Like, I don't know
Maybe.
what is going on.
I never had trouble, and I'm not even bragging. I was like, they just
Yeah.
have British accents. Like, I don't
It's like
know
they
what
just
to
have,
tell
yeah,
you.
I don't know.
Speak old timey. Yeah.
It's like,
old-timey
I don't know.
speak.
I know so many people that gave up on Peaky Blinders so they couldn't understand what anyone was saying. And I was like, for real, like, I get it, but like, also like, really? Like they're speaking, I don't know. Anyway. Continue.
But The Witch is
Carry on.
another one though that was marketed because that was I think
Yeah.
that was their really big
So
first
scary.
commercially like where like they were like we can market this to be for money.
Right.
But everything out of there was it is one of the most unsettling,
Yes.
horrifying horror films you'll ever see,
Mhm.
and people did not think that when they went to go see it.
It's
Yeah.
divisive. It's divisive. That's another word for synonymous with A24. Divisive.
Correct.
Very
yeah.
divisive.
There were people
saw-
in my theater, like it was not a full theater. And there were people who literally, as they're getting up and packing their bag, is like, well, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, people
You're
were
just
pissed
like,
at that
okay,
movie.
here we go.
Yeah,
I
people-
fucking ate it up with the spoon, and
Oh,
people
God,
like,
yeah.
man, that was the dumbest, worst fucking movie I've ever seen. And you could hear people complaining at the end of the
Oh yeah.
outside of the theater, and I'm thinking like, this movie was great. I
It's
would
so
like to
good.
live
Really?
deliciously.
I saw
Um,
it. Yeah, I don't know. I saw it at a pretty crowded theater, like not on opening weekend, and everyone seemed fine.
But I can get why it wouldn't be for a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
It's slow. but also it's a movie though where you can be like, oh yeah, this witch grinds a baby to a pulp. This crow eats off a woman's nipple. Like there's a lot of stuff where you can describe it like, oh, that sounds really hardcore. But when you watch it, people are like, oh, that I was expecting something a lot worse, you know. Green Room.
Green Room's like fun and like what a fun. I mean, as fun as Nazis can be, but like it's very fun.
I think I'm the only one that's
punk rock as shit.
Yeah. Has anyone seen The Monster besides me? Okay. Big recommend. It's Zoe Kazan and her daughter, but she's like an alcoholic, and their car breaks down in the middle of like this wood like road, and because they hit a monster, and the whole movie takes place like in their car, like with the monster outside. Yeah. Blackcoat's daughter.
Cool looking monster.
Which I watched.
Yes.
Just now.
Oh, it's a practical monster too.
Oh, it's a practical monster. Yeah. Okay.
Ooh,
It's kind of reminiscent of The Relic. Like that's the design of the monster.
Yeah.
Kind of
looks like. Really?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And it's a movie where you're like, okay, so that's a good example of a movie where you're like, oh, it's A24. Is the monster just going to be in their heads? It's a representation of our alcoholism, and it is a metaphor for that, but it's also a very real monster that is attacking them.
So it's not It Comes at Night, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which next up is Blackcoat's Daughter, It Comes at Night, which I think that's a 1-2 punch of the witchy type films.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like if Blackcoat's Daughter had been released now, like later after a bunch of more successful A24 films, I think it would be like a shining beacon in the studio's kind of wheelhouse. Yes. And instead, I feel like it's kind of the lost, forgotten child that, you know, people who love it a lot, but a lot of people are just like, what is that? Never heard of it.
I didn't realize how old it was. Like I just watched it today and I was looking it up because one of the actresses looked familiar and I was like, not the very obvious ones, but and so I was like, oh, what do I know her from? And like went to look it up and it's like 2014 and I was like, what? I feel like people talk about it like it just came out.
Wait, this is Blackcoat?
Yeah.
Oh, because it was shelved for like, it didn't come out until 2017, but it did festivals in 2014 and 2015.
Yeah. And a title change and
and I think like what you were saying, it's been so like fell through the cracks. And I think Blackcoat's Daughter is one of those ones that people really, really need to see, especially if you like movies like Hereditary, where it deals with the psychological trauma. I think Blackcoat's Daughter should be a feather in the cap for A24 horror.
That was cool. But I get it. Like, even as someone who really enjoyed it, there was like the first half hour. I was like, but I like the first half hour, maybe even 40 minutes. I like rewound it a couple times because I noticed that I had like completely zoned out and I could tell that it was a movie where details were going to matter.
Yep.
Right.
And so like there were a couple times where I would like totally zone out, not even notice I was doing it. And I'd be like, oh God, why have I been pouring coffee for 20 minutes? Like
I've done that when I'm listening before where you're like, I feel like I'm listening, but then like you realize 5 minutes has passed and you just heard my mwah.
Yeah. You're like, I have not gotten any of it. So I like it took me like 2 hours to watch it because I kept being like, I think there was a flashback in there and I just did not see it.
Now it comes at
slow.
Yeah. Speaking of slow, It Comes at Night made me physically angry.
Oh,
it
that
made
movie
me physically upset.
Because people wanted to see It, and I get it, but what I like, and it's a movie I don't want to revisit, but I do like about that movie is that we know, presumably, there has been this, pandemic or whatever that destroyed the world. I love that we don't leave the house. We were only seeing everything from the POV of these characters, but because of that, there's not a action-y payoff. There's an emotional payoff with a conflict that people don't care about, which is the one between the two sets of parents. Right. People are like, no, I want you to fight the zombies or whatever the fuck is out there. So that's
not what the movie ever was.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a bait and switch. If you're gonna say It Comes at Night, what the fuck comes at night? You better make it about it at some point in time. I mean, and I saw that movie twice, thinking, okay, maybe the first time I was so angry at it. Maybe, it was just me, bad day, low blood sugar.
The start of Jenius's origin, like villain origin story against A24.
No, really, it is, because if I get a visceral hate for a movie, I will watch something again to make sure that if I'm warranted or trusted. They were exactly. So I was upset at It Comes at Night. Like, I'm gonna watch it again, make sure I have something in my stomach, so I make sure there's none of that. Second time, I was like, exactly. Exactly.
There is a dog in that movie. Well, okay, wait. So I'll kind of speed through these, but Killing of a Sacred Deer, not audience friendly. I fucking love that. Is a 5-star film for me. I love that film. I find it hilarious and very upsetting.
Agree on all points.
Yeah.
Is A24 behind Lanthimos's other films, or is that the only one that they've done with him?
They have done The Lobster.
Okay.
I don't think they did The Favorite.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Then there's Hereditary, which we already discussed. Slice, we've kind of touched on. Hole in the Ground. I actually don't remember the ending of Hole in the Ground, so I don't remember if that's a depressing one.
It's a little grim, but
okay,
not too bad.
Climax.
I mean, I know that we've actually covered that one, Trace, but that one to me is kind of like, it's where A24 is straddling the line between like art and horror, because I've known so many people who were like, this shouldn't have been programmed at Midnight Madness for TIP because it's not a horror film. And you're just like, okay, well, we can have those debates another time. But yeah,
also Midnight Madness isn't all horror. It's
exactly
all weird,
it's
offbeat
genre.
It's genre, yeah.
Like High Life. I wouldn't consider that straight up horror,
right?
But
yeah,
there's some horrific shit in there, and I really liked that movie a lot.
And that is A24 as well. I didn't have it on my list, but you are right, Genius. And then Midsummer, we've kind of touched on. The Lighthouse, well, without having seen it, I would say it's not audience friendly.
Hark! Lighthouse is dope.
Ugh, I'm so sorry about. I'm gonna try to yell during barking fits, but The Lighthouse is a movie that I saw where I was like, oh, I don't like this at all, but people who like this movie are
will
gonna
like it a lot.
love this movie. Yeah. Like it was. Do you ever have those like moments where you're like, this is not for me, but I know that people are gonna love it? That's how I felt about The Lighthouse.
Yeah. We just covered Near Dark on the podcast. That was me for Near Dark. And then In Fabric we've already discussed. I think that's the last one on record I have. There might be something more recent that hasn't been updated yet, but nevertheless, that's the bulk of them that we've covered.
So. Interesting. It's kind of fascinating because you can see that trajectory, and yet there are outliers where people would be like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that's an A24. That doesn't connect to what I associate the studio with. And I don't know.
I mean,
at
the end of the day,
it's Robert Eggers and Ari Aster. It's just two guys.
Saint Maud came out in 2021.
There you go. Saint Maud. Well, yeah. So at the end of the day, like to kind of like move us into the wrapping up process, at the end of the day, I think what we've learned is it is not just, Ari Aster and Robert Eggers. And there's actually a lot of variety in A24, more so than honestly even us would have expected. Because there were some on this list where I was like, fuck, I didn't know that. So for me, really, I guess it's unfair to have that stigma that you were talking about, Genius, over what A24 is, because there is so much variety. I'm more inclined, because I would go, oh yeah, it's going to be a slow burn, like kind of a drama with genre elements type film. And that really, based on this history, is not what they've only done. It's the ones that have made it to mainstream, like popular consciousness, but there's so much more that didn't, that are not those things. Yeah.
Watch Zola, y'all. It's on Netflix now. Like
Zola is great and a hilarious movie.
So great. It's right there.
I personally can't wait for Everything Everywhere All at Once.
So yeah.
That one, I've been excited for that one for a while now.
It's amazing.
And I was really surprised with X. And I got to stop hearing when I hear the term, oh, it's very A24-esque, or it's an A24 movie. I got to stop that, because they're way more. And I wish they would realize that too. They're way more than Robert Eggers and Ari Aster.
So you're saying fire them?
No. I'm not saying fire them, because I am so hyped for the Northman. It is ridiculous how hyped I'm for the Northman.
No, that for me is going to be one of those ones where I'm like, this is not going to be for me, but I'm sure people will love it.
You preemptively decided. That's so good of you.
See, you're same thing. Like, A24.
I don't care about Viking shit. It is a setting and a time period where I'm like, I have zero interest in any of this. So.
Good criticism.
But
I'm gonna be fair.
Critics, if he was watching it to criticize, it would be very different than picking it for himself. I feel like those are different discussions.
This is true. Yeah. But I do like that takeaway that we should probably all be like a little bit more open-minded when we hear the term, because the studio itself, I mean, whether or not they're always marketing it the way that they should is up for debate. But if you look at the catalog, they actually have done a really decent job of diversifying the kinds of films that they're making.
Also, everyone, if they're ever, you can't claim false advertising if you're like, it wasn't scary and they're saying it's scary, because scary is subjective.
Yeah,
so as long as at least one person was scared by it, it's not false advertising.
But they need to stop advertising that it's the scariest movie of all time.
That
and the
would
scariest
help.
movie
Well, you know
ever
what?
made.
Tell critics to stop putting that in their reviews.
Yeah, the pull
Yeah,
quotes
that's
are the
true.
most damaging part.
Mhm.
That is 100% true, because like you said, what's scary to one, it could not scary to another one. But I like the fact that upcoming they got a lot of upcoming good stuff, like that Men one.
Ooh, yeah.
Let's see, what else do they have? Another one. Pearl is up and coming. I'm looking forward to that.
And their customized logos for every film. I love that they do that.
All right.
I hope they continue that.
Yes. Yeah. Because it's a smart branding issue for no other reason. But
like for the North American runes.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how about we wrap up our discussion of A24 there? Jenius, if people want to track you down, how can they get a hold of you?
You can search me up on Facebook. It's Jenius McGee, Jenius with the J. Twitter, I'm L_Jenius. You can also follow my podcasts, Nerds and Nostalgia. Nightmare Junkhead is the big one. Nightmare Junkhead on Twitter and Facebook, Nightmare Junk, and then Meteor Rewind. So that's on all the socials. Nice. And Lindsay, what about you?
We almost made it without, but the dog is gonna happen. We almost made it the whole time. I'm so sorry. It's because it's where I am physically in the house during it that he just so you can follow me. I'll just shout over him. I'm so sorry. It's so brutal. Okay. You can follow me on socials on Instagram and Twitter at Smash Travis, SMASHTREVES, and that is the best way to find me.
Yeah, and of course we'll put these into the show notes as well, so that if people couldn't hear over the dog, which they could, you're fine. You're fine. They're right there. All right, this has been another fun Horror Queers hangout. Thank you both so much for joining us, and we will be back next month with a different weird topic to discuss.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Bye.